Today marks Africa Day. It was first declared in 1963 to commemorate the establishment of the Organization of African Unity, the predecessor of the AU. But it's since evolved into a day that recognizes the continent's potential. Economic and social struggles are the continent's main challenges, and this year's theme is A Better Africa, a Better World. Well, let's get you more on Africa Day now. I'm joined live in our Nairobi studios by Dr. Adams Olo, an international relations expert at the University of Nairobi. And also joining us live from Johannesburg is Matebe Chizisa, a visiting scholar under the Governance and Foreign Policy Program at the South African Institute of International Affairs. Matebe, let's start with you in Johannesburg. Of course, we know several celebrations planned in the Southern Africa region for Africa Day. Why is it important to celebrate the occasion?
Hi, thank you for having me. Well, Africa Day, as you said, is a commemoration of the Organization of African Unity as well as African Union that started in 2002. And some of the celebrations, for example, that are occurring in South Africa are today President Jacob Zuma is hosting annual discussions at the Presidency Guest House in Pretoria, where he will be reaffirming South Africa's support towards the African Union, as well as stating the main theme of South Africa this year, which is the year of OR Tambo, building a better Africa and building a better world. And this is very important in creating the sense of unity and collectivism on the continent, as well as in the diaspora. The continent has been plagued with a number of issues focusing mainly on women and violence and coups on the continent, as well as digital gender divide, which has been subsiding in the continent. And this is important to realize these problems in an effort to come up with collective solutions towards this.
Indeed. And Dr. Olo, let's bring you in here now. As we heard there, Matebe saying many sort of important events planned for the day in terms of recognizing Africa Day. From your perspective, why is it important to reflect on the gains made on this occasion?
Well, I think just as you correctly said, that it was an initiative from the OAU when it first was formed. And at that particular time, you'll find that quite a number of African countries were not independent. Some were still under colonialism. And you'll also find that at the time that most African countries got independence, they were basically still poor. Quite a number of them had not formed any links in terms of having regional economic communities in order to bargain in the international forum. And you also find that quite across board, most of them were basically agriculturally based societies as opposed to industrially based societies. So I think that going forward, one can say that economically, Africa has slowly started to come of age. Socially, one can also say that the disparate ethnic groups that ended up being cobbled together by the colonialists to form nationhood, some have progressed, some are still struggling, as evidenced by a few civil wars here and there. And also you'll find that in terms of education, empowerment, you can say that quite a number of African countries are now educationally empowered. And I think that the change from OAU to AU has kind of started the lurch towards having one voice for the whole of Africa. Indeed. So that is something to be celebrated. Of
course, it's clear, and as you know, with some of the things you've mentioned, Dr. Olo, that indeed Africa has come a long way. But returning to you, Matebe, you know, we've seen, as you've raised a little earlier, concerns over violence against women in many countries in Africa, but most recently, many protests on that issue in South Africa. Just how important is it for us to reflect on these kind of social challenges that persist on the continent?
Well, it's very important, especially in South Africa, where women make up almost half of the population. And there have been increases in violence acts in the last couple of months in where they've been marginalized and made to feel vulnerable. And it's unfortunate that there have been such gruesome attacks which have opened the government's eyes to a problem that did not just start last week or last year. This has been going on for decades. So it's very important to realize that there needs to be a shift from the patriarchal mindset that has often been plaguing the South African communities, and as well a change from the highest level of governments. So this includes the Ministry of Women and Children's Rights in order to protect them. So for example, leaders leaders at these levels need to ensure that what they are saying should be responsible in terms of not blaming the women for being victimized, however, but putting the correct response and the correct actions against men who are harming them. And in addition to this, there needs to be a multi-sector collaboration, specifically in terms of the police departments when women go and first report abuse attacks and attacks of violence in their own relationships. Such reports need to be taken very seriously as well as investigated and finding out the root to the problem so as to avoid escalations as was seen in the last couple of months.
Indeed.
And in addition to this, there needs to be a creation of a buddy system amongst police officers, specifically for every female policeman, for every female policewoman, there should be also a male policeman. And this will ensure that women are not made to feel protected and are not feeling anxious when they walk into the taxi ranks or are taking public transport home. Indeed. And there need to be safe spaces created in order for women to be able to report this abuse and not be afraid to go to their local communities and tell them what is going on. And as I mentioned, there has to be a change in the mindset of not only citizens, but as well as the leaders. This is a problem, as mentioned, that has been going on for a number of decades now and has been often swept under the rug as a sort of embarrassment and a shift in not being culturally acceptable. And this needs to change now. And unfortunately, these gruesome attacks which have brought to light an actual violence that's happening constantly in South Africa, in their communities, needs to be addressed.
Well, as you say there, Matebe, of course, you know, we know what needs to be done, but it takes political will and leadership to make it happen. And much can be said when we look at challenges that persist around conflict and instability. When we look to the future, do you think we might resolve some of these persistent challenges around conflict? I mean, it's quite disappointing to think that Africa's youngest country, South Sudan, could make it 5 years without descending into 2 civil wars.
Well, I think that's quite an unfortunate thing because you'll find that most of the African countries, when they got their independence in the 1960s, you'll remember that quite a number of them were brought together by nationalism against the colonialists. But immediately they got independence, most of them faced civil wars in terms of who would be in power and who would be out. And it appears that on that front, Africa has not learned so much, as you correctly say, of South Sudan, that you find that the sufferings that South Sudan suffered under Sudan for very many years, and they came up with a movement, the SPLM and later the SPLA, which finally merged together. And I remember having a personal conversation with one of the ambassadors and warning that the problem in Africa is that once the common enemy is gone, usually they turn against each other. And he swore that what they had gone through, they would never split. But the reality is that at times in Africa, the ethnic nation is stronger than the central nation that has been created. And I think that's a challenge that leadership in Africa has to grapple with. I think a good example of a leader who resolved that was Mwalimu Julius Nyerere in Tanzania, and also Nelson Mandela in South Africa. And I think that if African leaders who come to power, irrespective of whether they come from a big tribe or a small tribe, could work towards building that African nationalism, then this day would be worth celebrating. Indeed. In a more positive manner.
Indeed. Well, thank you so much for those reflections. Dr. Adams Olo live with me here in our Johannesburg studio, and thank you very much to Matebe Chizisa, who joined us there from Johannesburg.